So tonight we're going to start chapter 2 of Pirkei Avos, Ethics of Our Fathers, and we are probably, or actually, I'm only planning to cover one Mishnah tonight because this Mishnah is packed with. It could have been 3 different Mishnahs. Has a lot going on. So the Mishnah begins as follows. It says, Rebbe Omer. So Rebbe, by the way, Rebbe just means, my teacher, the teacher. So it refers to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, the leader of the Jewish people, and the compiler of the Mishnah. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said as follows: Ezohi derech yeshara sheyavar lo ha'adam. What is the straight path that a person should choose? Kol shehi tiferes le'osa v'tiferes lo min ha'adam. Whatever is a honor or a splendor to the one who does it, and it's an honor or a splendor from man, from other people. So I'll have to explain what that means. And one should be careful with a light mitzvah as much as a stringent mitzvah. Because one doesn't know, you don't know the reward for mitzvos. So treat the light mitzvos like the severe mitzvos. And one should evaluate the loss of a mitzvah versus its reward. And the reward for a transgression versus its loss. And I'm deliberately not really explaining these lines because we'll go through them, clause by clause. And a person should focus on 3 things. And if one does, then you won't come to sin. And those 3 things are, there's like a further introduction. One should know what is above you. Or I guess that could be number 1 of the 3 things. Know what is above you. Ayin roeh ve'ozen shomas. This could be number 2, which is there's an eye that sees and an ear that hears. So actually, it depends it says know what is above you. That might be number 1, or that could be an introduction to the next 2, which are the 2 things. The first 2 are that you should know that above you there is an eye that sees and an ear that hears. And lastly, v'chol ma'asecha b'sefer nichtavin. And all of your deeds are written in a book. So on the most basic level, that last clause is saying that we have to understand that our actions are being observed. God observes our actions. Know what is above us, meaning that God is watching us, that he has an eye that sees, an ear that hears, and that all of our deeds are tracked and make a difference, whether they're for the good or for the bad. God is keeping track of our actions. But let's go back and just pose a few general questions about the Mishnah. And then we'll try to go through piece by piece and offer different understandings. So the Mishnah begins. What is the straight path that a person should choose? What kind of a question is that? We have a Torah, right? A guidebook for life. So the answer should be very simple. The path one should choose is whatever the Torah says to do. That's what we should choose. Why are we offering an alternative here? A person should choose the path that is splendorous for those who do it, and a splendor or honor from other people. What kind of a question is this in the first place? We don't just choose our path. We have a path that's given to us. So that's the right? And actually there's verses, for example, it says, Yesharim darchei Hashem, the ways of God are straight. That's the straight path, the ways of God. It says that v'hodata lahem es haderech yelchuva. God says to Moshe, actually at Sinai, he says, you should tell them the way that they should go, the path that they should choose. So we have a path already, given to us. So what's the question? What is the path that a person should choose? Furthermore, if we pay close attention, we'll notice that the tense of the Mishnah changes. So at first it's in third person. At the beginning of the Mishnah, the first clause says, what is the straight path that a person should choose? And it says something that's honorable, etc. That's in third person. A person, it's not talking to you, it's not talking to me, it's not saying what path should you choose. It says, what path should a person choose? And then it turns to speak in, I guess, second person directly to us. And it says one should be careful with mitzvos because you don't know the reward for them. So, and focus on three things, and you won't come to sin. So it changes in the middle from third person to second person tense, from speaking just about people to speaking to you and to me. Another question. So it says you should calculate the loss of a mitzvah versus the reward of a mitzvah. And we have to understand what that means, but just on before we even delve into it, we just said that we don't know the reward for mitzvahs, right? We said, it says in the Mishnah, one should be careful with a light mitzvah versus a stringent mitzvah, whatever that means, because you don't know the reward for the mitzvahs. And then it says that you should calculate the loss of a mitzvah versus the reward of a mitzvah, but just that we don't know the reward for the mitzvahs. So it seems to contradict itself just from one line to the next. And finally, we'll pose one more question, which is that we learned in the Mishnah right at the very beginning. The Mishnah says one should not serve God in order to receive reward. And here it's saying one should calculate the loss of a mitzvah versus the reward for it. So all of a sudden it's telling me that I should pay attention to the reward for a mitzvah. So which one is it? Is this a dispute? Is this Mishnah arguing on the Mishnah of Antignos Ish Socho from the very beginning? I think the third Mishnah of chapter 1 that said a person should just serve God, not to receive reward. Here, all of a sudden, we're saying you should focus on the reward. Think about the loss versus the reward. So those are just a few questions that we'll have to visit and try to answer as we go. So we'll start with the opening clause. The opening clause of the Mishnah, Ezohi derech yishara, what is the straight path? Sheyavor lo ha'adam, that a person should choose. Kol shehi tiferes la'oseh v'tiferes lo min ha'adam. Anything that is a splendor to the one who does it, and a splendor from other people. An honor, again, honor or splendor. So the first thing we should know is that actually there's different versions of this Mishnah. There's a slight difference in the wording, which is that the way that I have it printed on the source sheets is anything that is a splendor li'oseha, to the one who does it. Some didn't have that conjugation, but had kol shehi tiferes li'oseh, to the one who does or the one who makes. And it actually could refer to God as the maker, the creator, and saying that the path that one should choose is that which is a honor to the creator and an honor in the eyes of people. And what it would be telling us is that we are to choose a path, to choose deeds that are both an honor to God and an honor to people. Some understand actually that one will be an outgrowth of the other. If we choose a path that's an honor to God, then that will also bring honor from people. Again, not that we're seeking honor, but even without seeking honor, we should still want to act in a way that is honorable before people. Now, going back to the question I posed before, though, what is the Mishnah even asking? What is the path that a person should choose? And the answer is, something that's honorable before God. Well, we have a path, we have a Torah. So perhaps the idea here is that not in every instance is there an explicit direction from the Torah for how to conduct ourselves. And we actually find in Jewish literature a concept of what is the will of the Torah. Or we have an idea, we seek out the advice of great Torah scholars, and we refer to that as da'as Torah, knowledge of Torah, meaning the perspective of Torah. And there's actually another concept in the parsha of Kedoshim. It says, Kedoshim to you, you should be holy, the Torah tells us. How does one do that? How do we be holy? So there's one opinion, the Ramban of Nachmanides is it means that a person he goes sort of in the other direction. To be holy means not to do things that are technically permitted, but really clearly, not a way that a person should be comporting themselves. His language in Hebrew is not to be a naval birshut haTorah, not to be like disgusting with the permission of the Torah, meaning just because the Torah doesn't explicitly forbid something doesn't mean that it's a good idea and something that we should be doing. So I think it's possible that what these commentaries who understand that the Mishnah is saying that what's the path a person should choose? So of course, if the Torah says that we should behave a certain way and do certain things, then and not do other things, that's what we should do. But the Torah doesn't tell us every single detail, every single moment of our lives, how to conduct ourselves. At times, we have to figure it out on our own. We want to come from a perspective of Torah. We want to discover what is the will of God for me in this situation, but it's not always clear. So the Mishnah is telling us that in those situations also, though, we have to look for that. We have to think, we have to consider what is the will of God in this? What would be honorable to God in the way I conduct myself? A person jumps the line. So he or she skips the front of the line, and somebody starts yelling at him. How can you skip the line? He says, what do you mean? It doesn't say in the Torah that you're not allowed to skip the line. I didn't see it anywhere, right? So first of all, there could be many different verses in the Torah that could possibly teach us that one is not allowed to skip a line. It could be stealing time from other people. It could be just not acting in a straight manner. But just as an example, right, that someone might say, but it doesn't say in the Torah that I'm not allowed to do this. Okay, that's true. But if it's not going to be honorable before people, then you already have a problem. And in that particular example, it also probably won't be honorable before God. So a person has to try to, we learn Torah, we try to discover and develop a perspective of what would God want me to do in this given situation. And that could be what this first clause of the Mishnah is teaching me. What is the path that a person should choose when the Torah doesn't dictate it? The answer is trying to consider what would be honorable in the eyes of God and honorable in the eyes of people. Another possibility is that it's true the Torah tells us what we should be doing with our lives, what kind of mitzvos, what is a proper use of a person's time. It doesn't say, though, quantities, doesn't say how much. And the answer might just be, it's a case-by-case basis, what a person should engage in, but one should consider what is, according to their situation, what would be honorable for them, what would be honorable before other people. And it may be just coming to teach me about, in general, sort of quantities. How much should I be doing? Again, it's still not specific. It's not just a one-liner here, but we have to try to figure out based on where we are, who we are, what's honorable before God, what's honorable before others, to try to figure out what is the proper quantity or maybe division of time that I should dedicate myself to the various types of mitzvos. Along those lines, we have two categories of mitzvos in general. One is mitzvos that are between man and God, and others are mitzvos between man and man, a person and their fellow human beings. Now, these are both essential parts of Jewish life. In fact, when we talked about the three things that the world stands on, we said it's Torah, avoda, service of God, and acts of kindness. So that covers both between man and God and between man and his fellow. And there has to be a proper division within one's life of both of these categories in order to reach our potential, to reach our highest level of perfection that we can, and to really fulfill our purpose and bring ourselves close to God. That's what we discussed at that time. But let's say a person would like to lean one way or the other, focus more on, and again, it's not an exact division of time, right? We say, if you're awake for 16 hours a day, you should do 8 hours of between man and God and 8 hours between man and man. It's not really how it works, but there should be some amount of division, of equality, of at least each one is giving its fair share. Maybe we could say it that way. Each one should be giving its fair share. A person should try to be involved in both types of activities. However, let's say a person says, what I would rather do is, I understand I need to do both. So let me do the bare minimum of one of them, and I'm going to spend most of my time engaged in the other one. So is that acceptable? So the Mishnah could be asking, not what is the path that a person should choose, but if a person would want to choose one path over the other, which is not necessarily recommended, but let's say a person really wants to. So what is a path that they can choose? If they want to choose to focus primarily on either being Adam Lamakom, between man and God, or they want to focus primarily on between being Adam Lachavero, between man and his friend, which of those paths is an acceptable option? And the answer that the Mishnah gives to that is that an acceptable option would be to choose one that is both an honor to the person before God, and also an honor before other people, meaning the one that involves other people. Because a mitzvah that's between man and God is just between man and God. But a mitzvah that's between man and another person is both between man and God and that other person. In other words, we're still fulfilling a commandment of God when we are doing acts of kindness, when we are helping others, etc. So if this is another way to learn this Mishnah, what is a path that a person can choose if they want to choose a specific path? Not necessarily that we recommend it. We really recommend that a person should spend a significant amount of time on mitzvos between man and God, a significant amount of time on mitzvos that are between man and his friend or her friend. But let's say a person wants to choose one path. So if one is going to choose to primarily focus on one path, the Mishnah would be teaching us that it should be the one that is an honor both before to the one who does it, maybe before God, and an honor before other people, meaning the being Adam Lachavero, the mitzvah that is between man and his friend. So and even though, as the Mishnah continues, we don't know the reward for mitzvahs, right? Even though we don't know the reward for mitzvahs, but But still, if one is going to choose to primarily focus on one path, it should be man and his friend rather than man and God. But Midrash Shmuel says it's better to not choose one over the other. It's best to treat all of them equally and have a significant focus on both kinds of mitzvos. Okay. Another explanation for the Mishnah is that what is a path that a person should choose? So a path that will be honorable for the person and honorable before others. And what this may be saying is that a person should not take on what we would call like midas chasidus, like being too stringent in areas that they're not quite ready for that. Certainly the Mishnah is not, if a person should abide by the strict law, by strict halacha, but there are things that are sort of beyond the letter of the law. And that's great for certain people, but there's certain people who are not really ready for that. And if they do it, if a person keeps all the stringencies, the biggest stringencies, and they're not really holding there, they kind of jump there, right? So other people look at them funny and they say, that person thinks that they're ready to take on all these stringencies, they're not ready for that. And whether that's the right reaction of another person or not, but the Mishnah may be saying that a person who's not like this great Torah scholar should not be acting like they're this great Torah scholar and taking on all these stringencies and the one who's praying for 2 hours and etc. Right? So a person has to kind of know where they're holding and not try to jump too high, because if a person does, then in the eyes of others, it can cause people to sin, because it will cause people to talk about that person and frown upon that person if they're acting in a way that's really beyond them. Now, a person would say, "Oh, but this is a splendorous way to act, right? I want to act this way." So a person has to realize that it's not for everyone, and it's not necessarily going to be splendorous for them. So it would be teaching us that we just have to be aware of who we are, and that doesn't mean we're not trying to grow and take on more, but we have to realize that certain stringencies may not be for us in our place where we're holding. That's another way to understand this line, that what's the path the person should choose? Something that's honorable. But if it's something that, all of a sudden that person thinks they're this and that, if that's the reaction that it causes people and it's not honorable in the eyes of others, so then it could be that we're not ready for those stringencies. Again, if it's the basic Jewish law, then one should be fulfilling that. And we shouldn't say, but if I fulfill basic Jewish law, people will say this and that about me. Okay, that's basic Jewish law, I should still do it. But if it's something that's sort of beyond the letter of the law, so that's where we have to consider if that's something that's fit for us to take on. Okay, so just to summarize so far, because we threw out a few ideas. So we're discussing this line: what is the path that a person should choose? Something that's a splendor either before God, or a splendor for the one who does it, and a splendor, an honor from others. So the first explanation we gave was that it's referring to situations where the Torah doesn't dictate what one should do, but I have to try to determine what is the perspective of the Torah. What would God want from me in this situation? What is God's will for me in this situation? And to consider what would be honorable in the eyes of God and what would be honorable in the eyes of people. And that would probably land us in good stead in terms of our decision of how to conduct ourselves in a given situation where the Torah doesn't tell us explicitly what to do. Secondly, we said it can help us determine sort of how to focus our energies. There's a lot of mitzvos, and it doesn't tell us how much to do of each one. So to consider, though, what is honorable for before God and what is honorable before others, and help use that to determine how to determine how much to be involved in one mitzvah and another one, etc. And sort of as an outgrowth of that, we said if a person maybe wants to choose to primarily focus, there's a third explanation, but what is the path that someone should choose if they want to choose one path over the other, of either mitzvahs between man and God or mitzvahs between man and his fellow? Really, it's better not to choose one over the other and to focus on both. But if one would want to focus on one or the other, which one should it be? So it should be the one that brings honor both from God and from man, which is the mitzvahs that are between man and his fellow. We're not saying that therefore one can completely ignore the mitzvahs that are between man and God. But if one wanted to focus on mitzvahs between man and his fellow and sort of do the bare minimum of mitzvahs between man and God, that, according to this explanation, would be acceptable, although not recommended, but acceptable, as opposed to the other way around. The Mishnah would be saying one should cannot settle with just the bare minimum of mitzvahs between man and his fellow, but and focus solely on mitzvahs between man and God, because that's not honorable before both God and other people. And finally, the fourth explanation we gave was that it's saying what is the path a person should choose in terms of what to take on, and we have to be mindful not to start to take on stringencies or things that are beyond the letter of the law if we're haven't grown or developed ourselves to where that is sensible and fitting for where we're holding, because that won't be honorable before others. It will just cause them to actually say, oh, who does that person think they are? Keeping all these extra stringencies, they're not ready for that. Okay. Now, moving on to the next clause of the Mishnah says that one should be careful with light mitzvos, like they would for stringent ones, severe ones, because one doesn't know the reward for mitzvos. So since we don't know the reward, we should treat the light ones as great as the more severe ones, stringent ones. What do we mean by light and what do we mean by stringent? Meaning, if I knew the reward, I could say the ones that have a big reward are the stringent ones, the ones that have a small reward are the light ones, but we don't know the reward. So what does it mean by stringent and what does it mean by light? So we have a few possible explanations. One could be that it's talking about the prohibitions in the Torah. Now, it happens to be that the Torah does delineate the consequence of many of the prohibitions. So, they range from no direct consequence to a requirement to bring offerings, to lashes, to death, to kares, which is like spiritual excision. So we have actually stated consequences for many of the negative commandments of the Torah. And it could be within that context that we're referring to those that are light and those that are stringent. And it could be saying, a person might say, well, a mitzvah, or a mitzvah just means a commandment. So we can have a negative mitzvah, negative commandment, a positive commandment. So a negative mitzvah, a prohibition, that I know it has a severe consequence, a person might think that that's much more serious than one that has a lesser consequence. And not only that, but I might think the reward is much greater for something, if it has such a severe consequence, so then refraining from it must be really important. And therefore, if it's so important, it must have a great reward for refraining from it. So let me refrain from the mitzvah that has this terrible stated consequence, but one that doesn't have as much of a consequence or has no stated consequence, I won't refrain from because it's not as big a deal, clearly, and I don't get as much reward for refraining from it. That's what a person might say. To that, the Mishnah says, no, you don't know that. You don't know the reward for any mitzvah. It could be that it works the opposite, because it could be that something that the Torah tells us comes with a severe consequence. So then it's easier to refrain from that because I do it out of fear of the consequence. So that's easy to refrain from. But something that doesn't come with a severe consequence, so that's harder to refrain from. So maybe the reward for refraining from the mitzvah, from transgressing the commandment that has a lesser consequence, is actually a greater reward than refraining from transgressing something with a more severe consequence. Because I don't have as much of a deterrent, and yet I refrained. So maybe the reward is greater, or maybe not. We don't know. We don't know the reward for the mitzvahs. So that's what the Mishnah tells us. We don't know. And it's talking about negative commandments. It's saying when it comes to the prohibitions of the Torah, be as careful. And the language of careful, by the way, is usually associated with negative commandments. Zihirut, azhara, to be zahir, to be careful. So it's telling you, be as careful to refrain from the mitzvahs that have no stated consequence or a lesser stated consequence than those with a more severe consequence, because we actually don't know the reward for refraining from either of them. Both of them could have great reward. One could be greater than the other. We don't know, and we should refrain from them equally. It could also be talking about positive commandments. And what does it mean by a light mitzvah versus a severe mitzvah or a strict mitzvah? It could just mean that there's mitzvahs that are more light, meaning they're more accessible. They come up every day. We have opportunities to do them every day. We have opportunities to help people every day. And then there's the positive commandments that are much more rare. They're once a year, right? Once every 7 years, right? They come only once in a while. So a person might develop the attitude that those mitzvahs that just come around once a year, those are the ones that are, I'm really going to focus on. And the ones that I get that come along every day, a person might start ignoring them because it's not viewed as an opportunity to do a mitzvah, because it's always here and we come to take it for granted and then we ignore it. So the Mishnah is saying, no, even the light and easy mitzvahs, meaning the ones that can come our way all the time, we should treat with as much attention as those that only come along once a year, because we don't know the reward. And we have to view every opportunity to fulfill the will of God, to do a mitzvah, as an opportunity. And the truth is that it is an opportunity. And it may be as much of, a person so focused on making sure that they eat their matzah on once a year on Pesach, at the Seder, which is a big mitzvah. It's a Torah commandment even. But there are other Torah commandments that may come up on a daily basis. For example, to someone who, for at least a man who's obligated in time-bound mitzvahs, they have a mitzvah to recite the Shema every morning and every night. It's a Torah mitzvah, but it's so easy and comes along every day. So, and the person, it's supposed to be said within the first 3 hours, halachic hours of the morning. So it depends on without getting into all the details, but it's a fluctuating time from when it gets light. So it could be that the latest time to say is, now at this time of year, it's actually pretty early. It's like 9:20ish. It gets later. It gets to 10:30, 11, maybe not that late, but people aren't necessarily so careful. A person sleeps into 9:30. They missed their chance to say the Shema in the morning, a Torah commandment. Trust me, that person is not going to miss eating matzah on Pesach, right? Do we know which one has the greater reward? Which one is more important? Saying the Shema every morning or eating matzah on Pesach? We don't know which one's more important. That's what the Mishnah is telling us. There's easy mitzvahs, light mitzvahs that come along every day that a person may not be careful with. And then there's what we're calling sort of the more severe ones, meaning maybe severe is not strict severe, but it really in this interpretation means rare, less accessible, because they only come along occasionally. But the Mishnah says we have to treat all of these equally because we don't actually know which one's more important. They could be equal. One could be more important than the other. We don't know, so they should be treated equally. Okay. Then the Mishnah talks about calculating the loss of a mitzvah versus the reward, and the reward of a transgression versus the loss. Now, what does that mean? One should calculate, this is just the literal translation, one should calculate the loss of a mitzvah versus the reward of the mitzvah. What is the loss of a mitzvah? So the most simple explanation is what it means is a mitzvah might come at a cost. It might cost us money to do a mitzvah. Many do, right? We know about those bills on the holiday times, right? Many mitzvahs cost money. And sometimes they cost energy and time and they make us tired and whatever it might be, right? They come at a cost. So therefore, a person might say, I don't want to do this mitzvah. I'm too tired. It's too much of a wipeout. It costs too much money. And therefore, the Mishnah says, consider though the reward for the mitzvah. Don't focus solely on the loss of the mitzvah, the loss of money, the loss of energy, whatever it might be. Calculate that versus the reward. The reward is unfathomable. The reward is, spiritual bliss in the world to come, experiencing God in a way that we can't imagine. It's not even, it shouldn't even be a question which one's greater. That spiritual reward that awaits us as the result of drawing near to God through the mitzvos outweighs 1,000,000 times the cost, the financial cost, the cost of energy that goes into doing a mitzvah. So that's what the Mishnah is telling us. Calculate the loss that you're entertaining when deciding whether to do a mitzvah, but consider that versus the reward. And the same thing on the flip side with the prohibition. Calculate the reward that you're getting for the prohibition, meaning a person is tempted by some kind of physical pleasure or money that they could gain through a sin, through a prohibition, stealing, whatever it might be. So there's a temptation. And there's a reward, a immediate, tangible reward that awaits the person who steals or who enjoys a forbidden pleasure. But calculate that versus the loss that it's going to bring, the spiritual consequences. And again, the spiritual consequences for transgressing the word of God should heavily outweigh the momentary pleasure that a person can enjoy from a given transgression. That's the most simple approach, I think, to explaining this line. Calculate the loss that you might incur, the financial or physical loss you might incur for doing a mitzvah versus the tremendous reward that awaits one who does it. Calculate the momentary, the fleeting material and physical benefit in this world for a prohibition versus the great consequence that one would experience as a result of that transgression in the next world. Okay, another way to understand it is simply we hopefully train ourselves in performing mitzvahs. So we become used to doing them and they become natural to us, which is good and bad, right? Obviously, it's good to be in the habit of doing mitzvahs, but it's important still to think about what we're doing and to realize what we're doing and to do the mitzvos with passion and with love of God, with feeling. So the Mishnah could be speaking to that point and saying that when if a person does a mitzvah with thought and realizes they're making a conscious decision to do this mitzvah, and I'm giving up on something, so that itself, that actually enhances the mitzvah. If a person realizes that they're making a choice to do this, that actually can enhance the mitzvah. When they recognize the alternative, there is an alternative, right? If I'm so used to it, I'm so trained to do it, it's really good. But on the other hand, it becomes less meaningful, perhaps, as opposed to if I'm actually making the choice to do it. So to be conscious of, I'm choosing to eat the kosher food or to not eat something else, right? When I do a mitzvah, if I'm conscious of my decision, so it actually elevates it. So on both sides, when we do a mitzvah, to be conscious of the decision, what I'm choosing not to do, what I'm giving up. And when I avoid a prohibition, the same thing, to realize that I'm giving something up. I'm making a conscious decision not to transgress, not to engage in some physical pleasure or other potential prohibition, and it's a conscious decision, and that itself elevates it. And that could be what the Mishnah is telling us. Be mechashev, think about it, think about what we're doing, and realize that we're making a choice here, and that elevates the action. Another way to learn this Mishnah is that, going back to the first clause and connecting it, the Mishnah starts off, what is the path that a person should choose? So the Abarbanel says that what that is speaking to is someone who does, if we don't have a Torah, or maybe like we say, if we don't know what the Torah says in a given situation. If a person doesn't have the Torah, so then how do they choose what path? So they should choose something that is honorable, that people will view as respectable. That should be the path that someone should choose. Now, that said, we mentioned earlier in the third person, a person should be, what is the path that a person should choose? A path that is honorable, etc. But then it switches to second person. It says, and you should be careful with the easy mitzvahs like the hard ones, and calculate the value of a mitzvah, etc. And that's in the second person. It's talking to me and you. It's talking to us. And the difference is that in the beginning of the Mishnah, it's talking to the world at large. The world at large, what is the path that a person should choose? And this is true for someone who's Jewish, not Jewish, someone who has Torah, doesn't have Torah. What is the path the person should choose? Something that is respectable and honorable in the eyes of people. But that's really most relevant if we don't have the Torah. But if we do have the Torah, so then we have the path, like we mentioned earlier. And that's where we turn to second person. And now the Mishnah is talking to us. And it's saying to you, the Jewish people who have the Torah, so here's your path, the mitzvos, the commandments of the Torah. And be careful with all the commandments of the Torah, that's your path. What is the path that someone should choose? The path is to be careful with the easy mitzvos, the light mitzvos, equal to the most severe ones, and to treat them all with great importance. That's the path. We don't have to make choices. We don't have to decide based on our own intellect what path to take. We have, now at times we have to apply the Torah, but ultimately we're so fortunate to have a guidebook and to have the revelation of God's will for how we are to comport ourselves in this world. And then it tells us, and how should we do it? We should do it with alacrity. We should do it with love. We should be thoughtful and calculated in how we do it. So So that's what it says. Be careful. Actually, where it says, be careful with the easy mitzvos and the hard mitzvos. It means like, do it with energy, do it with love, do it with alacrity, whether it's an easy mitzvah, whether it's a hard mitzvah. And you'll ask, this is the Abarbanel talking. He says, now you'll say, obviously not all the mitzvos are equal, because he says, can you imagine, right? Somebody has a chance to answer amen to a blessing. Okay, that's not like an explicit mitzvah in the Torah, but it's something that we might refer to as a mitzvah to answer amen. Amen is confirming that we believe in God's ability to give and provide. So you have that opportunity for a mitzvah. On the other hand, you have two things in your calendar. There's, I need to attend a wedding where they're going to make some blessings. I want to answer amen. Or there's a person who I could go rescue, save their life, or rescue them from captivity. It's two different mitzvahs, right? I don't know which one is a greater reward. So maybe you'll say, be equally careful with the two of them. Abarbanel says that doesn't make any sense, right? Nobody would say that. There's a clear hierarchy. There's a clear preference in this case to go and save a life. So what's the Mishnah saying? To be as careful with a light mitzvah as with a more stringent mitzvah. It's saying in how we approach it, not saying that this one is just as important as the other one, and it should be, we shouldn't stop answering amen in order to run and save someone. We shouldn't do that. No, of course we should. But it's telling us that they should all be done. All the mitzvahs should be done with the same alacrity and the same love of God, in that they're all a fulfillment of God's will. So it doesn't matter what it is and how important it may seem in our eyes, but if it's a fulfillment of God's will, so then it should be done with the same level of energy. Okay. Fine. One other last interpretation of this, going actually back to the opening line, just an interesting way to read it, and different and novel way to read it. The opening line of the Mishnah was, what is the path that a person should choose? So what is the path that a person should choose? And it said, that which is a splendor to the one who does it, that which is a splendor before others. So the Midrash Shmuel quotes from Rav Moshe Al-Shakar, and he says, you know what this Mishnah is talking about? It's talking about V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your fellow like yourself. And this is how you read the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Ezohi derech sheyaver. What is the path one should choose? Let's get the text again in front of me. Ezohi derech yeshara. What is the straight path? Question mark. That's the question. The answer is sheyaver lo ha'adam. What the person would choose for himself. That's the answer to the question. Right? Up till now, we've been reading it. That's part of the question. What is the path that a person should choose for himself? And then we have the answer. He's reading it. The question is, what is the straight path? And the answer is what a man would choose for himself. In other words, if you want to know what to do in a given situation, how to relate to another person, well, what would you do for yourself? If it was you in that situation, how would you relate to the situation? And that's how we should treat others. That's the concept of loving your fellow like yourself. So whatever it is that we're doing, so we should think of it as if, what if it was me in that situation? Anytime we're relating to others, we should think about it as if it was ourselves, and then it will certainly be honorable in the eyes of God and in the eyes of others. So what is the straight path? What a person would do for themselves. That's what we should do for others, and that will be honorable in the eyes of God and honorable in the eyes of others. Okay, so finally we come to the last part of the Mishnah, which actually has some very, very fascinating ways of reading it. And it's very powerful and very simple, really, on the most basic level. It says a person should focus on three things and we won't come to sin. We have to know what's above us. And that is an eye that sees, an ear that hears, and all of our deeds are written in a book. So first of all, it doesn't say know what is above. It says know what is above you. And the statement know that what is above you is a way of bringing God closer to us. Meaning a person shouldn't think, oh, God's in the heavens, he's way out there, he doesn't care what's going on, he doesn't see what's going on. You know, maybe you could say he created the world and then abandoned it. No. Know what's above you. He's right above you. God is intimately involved in our lives and sees everything that's going on as if he's really right above us. So that's the know what is above you. Now, the most simple reading again of this Mishnah would be the concept of being able to focus on the idea that God is watching us, and we should constantly be aware of that. And if we're aware of that, so then that would obviously change our actions. God sees could be referring to not just what we do, but what we think. God sees our thoughts. God writes everything that we do in his book. He keeps track. That could be referring to actions. And God hears our words. Everything is covered, and nothing is forgotten. So if a person can focus on that on a consistent basis, then they would certainly live a different life. So that's the most basic teaching here. Some interpret the words, all of your deeds are written in a book, not to refer to what I just said, that it means, realize that God is writing all our deeds in a book, which I think is the basic understanding, but rather it's telling us once again that all of our actions that we need to know, all the actions that we need to do are written in a book in the Torah. We don't need to go, and figure out on our own what to do. We don't have to decide from our own feelings and our own upbringing, what's right and what's wrong, depending on what college we went to and what our first grade teacher taught us, etc. I mean, we do if they're teaching us Torah, but we have a guidebook that tells us what is right and what is wrong, what it is that we should choose. Everything we need is written in that book. And so that relates to what we said earlier, the way the Abarbanel interpreted the earlier part of the Mishnah. The earlier part of the Mishnah said, what is the path that a person should choose? If they don't have a Torah, they should do what's honorable in the eyes of others. But if one has a Torah, so then be careful with all the mitzvahs. That's the path that a person should choose. And now at the end, it would be saying that everything we need to know is written in a book. We have a guidebook for how to comport ourselves. Another novel way of reading this last clause it says know what's above you and know what's above you, eyes that see and ears that hear. So again, simply understood, that means you know what's above you, that's God, and he has eyes that see and ears that hear. Not literally, God's not physical, but God witnesses all that goes on. Another way to read the Mishnah is that know what's on the highest part of your body. What's above you, meaning what's on the highest point of a human being? Eyes and ears. Why? Why are eyes and ears at the highest point of our body? So one reason, it's more, because maybe that's where they'll be the most effective, but it's also teaching us that these are very important to fulfilling our mission. We need our eyes and our ears to be able to study Torah. We need our minds are the highest point, and our eyes and our ears, because these are the most important parts of our bodies in order to be able to arrive at our purpose in this world through Torah study. So that's another way to understand, very novel. Know what's above you. Know that your eyes and ears are at the highest point because they are so important to be able to study Torah. And then it says, and all of your deeds are written in a book. So that could also be understood. We said it could mean God, keeps track of all our deeds. It could mean that everything we need to know for what our actions and deeds should be, the mitzvos are written in a book in the Torah. Another way to understand it is that it's an instruction that we should write our deeds in a book, meaning that we should keep track of our own deeds. Otherwise, we forget if we did wrong. So we tend to forget, especially when we did wrong, and then we don't have a chance to contemplate it and do teshuvah and repent it and improve ourselves. So he suggests, Midrash Shmuel suggests, it could mean that if somebody does something wrong, they should write that deed in a book to be able to go back and consider how they can fix it. Alternatively, going back to the simple reading, is that it means that God keeps track of everything that we do, and this can have two important lessons in it. Besides for just the general lesson that our actions are important, they make a difference, and God is watching us. So beyond that, though, first of all, a person might sin, and a person, if they recognize that they've transgressed the word of God, the King and Creator of the universe, how can one recover from that? I even one sin, and a person might say, that's it, I give up. How can I ever rebound from that? I transgressed the will of the Creator of the universe. So the Mishnah tells us that all your deeds are written in the book. If it was one and done, then there would be no need for God to continue tracking what you do after the first transgression. That's it. You've transgressed the word of God. That's it. Done. But the fact that God continues to track what we do, that means that it's not one and done. There's opportunity for change. There's opportunity for teshuvah, for repentance and improvement. And that's the lesson that comes with that idea that God continues to write all of our deeds in a book, because he's continuing to keep track. There's still opportunity for a person to do teshuvah, to repent, and to improve. On the flip side, the very idea that our words, our actions are recorded by God is also empowering and inspirational. And it tells us that everything we do is important to God, and he keeps track of it. So that could mean transgressions, prohibitions, those make a difference. But also on the other flip side, on the positive sense, each of our actions is meaningful before God, and God puts that in his book. The Talmud actually says, with regards to the Torah, it says regarding certain people in the Torah, if Reuven saved Yosef from being killed by his brothers, and it says that if Reuven had known that his deeds would be recorded in the Torah, he would have done much more. He would have brought Joseph all the way home, right? Had he only known that he would be recorded in the Torah. And it says this type of idea about various people in Torah. Had they known that they would be recorded in this important book for the ages, so they would have acted differently. So the Mishnah is telling us that there's a book right? It's not the Torah, but God has a book, and he's recording each of our actions. And we should remember that. If we remember that every single deed that we do, every little minute detail makes a difference before God, whether for better or for the negative impact that it can have, but our actions are so impactful. And the Kabbalists talk extensively about this, the profound impact of even the smallest mitzvah, or God forbid, transgression, on all of the spiritual realms are unfathomable to us. But every action, every deed that we do, every word that we say, every mitzvah that we perform makes a difference, and God is keeping track of that. And ultimately, it has an impact on our world and the spiritual worlds now, and also impacts our relationship with God for our time in the future and the world to come. Okay, we'll stop there.